All right, very pleased to welcome JD Vance onto the Chris Buskirk show. This is one of our first. JD, you're one of the first people to do video with me, so I don't know if this somehow fails to record the video or something. I apologize in advance, but I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, no worries.
JD, I guess there's a lot to talk about, right? I mean, one of the things we should start with, though, is your movie. So you wrote a book in 2016, which was your autobiography, Hillbilly Elegy. Came out, sort of middle of the year of 16, and it's now been turned into, as they say, a major motion picture by Ron Howard.
Right.
What? Okay, so I guess I don't want to go to the movie first, so let's start with the book, though. I read the book. Like a lot of people really like the book. By the way, I hear people sometimes, I've read it in reviews, or I've seen people on Twitter say things about the book, which they and I've seen them say this about the preview that's out, has been out for a while now, which is, the book, I read it, I didn't like it. I'm like, I don't know. It's like, it's his life. What do you like? I'm not sure what that comment is supposed to mean. It wasn't like you were writing a novel. Like, I don't know. The main character didn't seem real to me.
Right.
But what made you write the book in the first place? It's not like you're 80 looking back on a lifetime. You wrote the book when you were sort of 30-ish?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I started writing the book towards the tail end of law school. And so, just a little background. I come from a working class background. Nobody in my family had been to four-year university before. Certainly nobody had been to law school before. And so, found myself in this environment in law school that's just incredibly unusual, very unique culturally. People worried about different things from what we worried about back home. And I sort of started to think to myself, if I feel so culturally out of place, then maybe it says something a little bit more broad about this concept of the American dream, this idea of sort of climbing the social ladder, which, of course, is sort of my story. People would meet me and say, oh, my God, you came from this hometown, you didn't come from a lot of money, and now you're sort of at this elite institution. You're the American dream. And it's like, on the one hand, certainly have had a very lucky life. On the other hand, there are some complexities there and some difficult things that I think a lot of people weren't really thinking about when they drew the simplistic conclusions from my life. And so decided to sort of write what was primarily going to be an investigation of social class, elite institutions, the American dream, opportunity, and so forth. And the more that I wrote it, the more that the people who read the various drafts that I did said, you really should turn this into a primarily personal book, because what's most interesting is not necessarily a sociology paper that you're citing that was written 15 years ago, but is sort of the life and the insights, the real characters that make you interested in this stuff, and you should talk about that. And so really weirdly, this sort of book that was kind of going to be this social commentary on the American dream became primarily a book about my own life, which, to your point, I'm not 80 years old, and looking back, it's kind of weird to sort of write your memoir when you're in your 30s, which is how old I was when I wrote the book. I'm 36 now. But I think in a lot of ways, like when I think about it, I'm really glad that I did it, because one of the things that was true when I wrote Hillbilly Elegy is that I was still sort of very much dealing with a lot of the implications of where I had come from, where I was going to school, what was going on back home, what was going on in sort of elite, primarily left of center America. And I think, frankly, my perspective on those issues is probably a little bit different now. And I'm sure in 30 or 40 years, it'll be way different. So I'm glad that I wrote the book when those memories, thoughts, and those feelings were very fresh, because I think it allowed me to be a little bit more raw and a little bit more honest.
So you, just for maybe people who haven't read the book, which they should remedy immediately if they haven't, but sort of the timeline for a lot of the things that you're reflecting on as you grow up in Southeast Ohio, family sort of straddles Ohio, Kentucky, right? And then you go to high school, graduate, go to the Marine Corps, go to Iraq, come back, go to Ohio State, go Buckeyes,
yep.
And then go to Yale Law School. Right. Which was, I guess, everything up until Yale Law School maybe is not totally unpredictable. Like somebody could see all of that when you were, it wouldn't, if somebody had said to people around you when you were 10 that something like that would happen, they wouldn't have thought that was crazy. Maybe all of a sudden it's kind of like you see curves that go parabolic. That's where like your life story sort of goes parabolic, and you go from something that's kind of sort of predictable to going to like the most elite of the elite law schools.
Yeah, that's right. And
sorry, Harvard.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sorry, Harvard. The thing that happened right when I got into Yale, that I sort of, this in some ways was one of the revelations that motivated me to write the book is, okay, you feel like you've made it in some sense, right? Like I wasn't, this is in 2010. People who are coming out of nice law schools were sort of guaranteed good salaries. I think that's still mostly true today. I myself had come from a family that was very financially unstable for pretty much the bulk of my childhood, but certainly during my teenage years. And so there was, on the one hand, this sense like, holy crap, this is my golden ticket. Never going to have to worry about money again. I'm going to have a great job. I'm going to have a job that people look up to and respect and admire. And then on the other hand, you get there and you're like, well, there's a lot about this place I actually don't like. There's a lot of sort of cultural alienation, a sort of fear that I have to pick between, we would say coastal elites today and my family back home. I wasn't really thinking about it in those terms, but certainly recognized that this upward mobility that I was experiencing was sort of coming along with a lot of like negative social and cultural effects. And at the same time was sort of realizing that a lot of the most traumatic moments of my childhood, a fair amount of addiction, certainly some family instability and dissolution, were sort of affecting the things that mattered most to me, right? So, if people among the college and professionally educated define the American dream, I think most of them would define it in terms of education, credentials, money made. And for me, it was like having a good enough job that you could put food on the table and having a happy, successful, stable family, right? Getting married to the right girl, having kids, that was sort of the American dream to me. And I found out that, having gotten to this place that I thought was my golden ticket, that for a lot of complicated personal reasons, things I had seen growing up, dynamics that existed in my family, it wasn't so easy to just translate all of that into, okay, I'm going to have, a wife and 3 kids and the white picket fence and all that stuff. Just a lot more complicated. And I think, what I really wanted people to sort of take from the book is this sense in which, when we talk about upward mobility, I think we have a very simplistic image in our mind. And what we really, I think, want American children of all social classes to be able to experience and to enjoy is just some measure of basic familial and professional stability. And that, turns out for me was pretty elusive until I recognized that I had some issues and had some things to overcome. And that's, in an important way, what the book is about. But you're certainly right that that weird inflection point in my life is what got me down the path of thinking about all these issues, at least for the first time in a systematic way. I think I'd been worried about them since I was in high school, right? I was always asking myself, why are families in my community so much less stable? Why is work so much harder to come by? Why are people just a little bit less hopeful about the future? Why do parents look to the future without that same sense of opportunity? These things were clearly all around me, but it was getting to Yale Law School that sort of made me realize just how distinct the place that I had come from was from this sort of new social class that I was entering.
Was there, when you got to Yale, was there sort of a particular moment, like a light bulb type moment where you're like, I come from the same planet, but a different world type of thing? Like, this is really different.
Yeah, there were a lot of those. I talk about, this story in the book of doing this firm recruitment dinner where you sit down and there are like 4 forks and 5 spoons and all these knives. And, people were asking you, do you want wine? It's like, yeah, sure, I'll take white wine. Well, do you want the Chardonnay or Sauvignon? It's like, I don't really know what that means, but just give me.
I said I want the white.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that piece is actually dramatized a little bit in the movie. But
all of a sudden you feel like there's some decision tree you don't know about, like, why And that they throw another set of questions at you, like, oh, if I choose one, is there another set after this?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the main thing that really caught me off guard was the way in which people were constantly leveraging their personal and professional relationships to get themselves something. Like, by the way, I don't think that this is always or even mostly good. I actually think that this sort of striver mentality, I have some really complicated feelings towards it. But, where I grew up, your friends were your friends. You stayed loyal to your friends, but you didn't necessarily expect to get anything out of your friends, right? Whereas at Yale, you were expected to develop these relationships with professors, with other students, with recruiters who are coming to campus, and you were always trying to sort of figure out how you could use these people to get ahead professionally. And I just found that so foreign. And on the one hand, like I said, I don't really like that striver thing. I think that it is in some ways corrosive in the culture of American elites. On the other hand, I sort of recognize that if this is the way that you do business, then I had clearly been pretty ignorant to something about how the world worked. And so there's always this sort of tension between recognizing that there's this new way of doing things and at the same time feeling that this new way of doing things isn't always that good.
Yeah, it's there's a friendship market, right? And somehow it's always transactional. It's like, well, I had this set of friends, and my return on that friendship was X, but I found out that I could get like 1.5X if I arbitrage those friends against this other potential group of friends.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I don't know, the cynical view on this would be, this is just the way the world works, and it's around networking, and it's built around relationships and so forth. But I do think that there's something pretty pernicious about thinking about your friends like that. And, one of the really great things about growing up in the place that I did is that I've always sort of resisted that a little bit. And I definitely, the friends that I feel like I made during my time in law school were people that I genuinely liked and admired and wanted to build relationships with. And, sometimes they haven't exactly paid off professionally, but that's like a good thing. And I try to remind folks, when I go back to speak at the law school or when I talk to people who are sort of, at a similar stage in their sort of early career and they're looking for things to do, I always try to remind them that that sort of what I call the striver mentality, that hyper transactional approach to friendships, it's not actually clear that it's that healthy or that good, either from a professional development perspective or from a personal development. And, again, it's one of those sort of mini cultural tensions that really illustrate the book and the transition from one place to the other.
You made me think of this, but at the end of the Declaration of Independence, all the signers pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors. Right? I cannot imagine. I can't imagine people at any elite institution signing something that had that just above their signatures. And B, if they did, nobody would believe that the other people meant it.
Right. No, that's right. Yeah, we've definitely become very cynical about this idea that honor and loyalty are valuable or important traits. And of course, one of the subtexts of the book, not when I'm in law school, but really, the early part of my childhood, is that my family is really fundamentally an Appalachian family, right? My grandparents grew up in southeastern Kentucky. They immigrated to southern Ohio and really built a life in Middletown, Ohio, which is, a steel town that really kind of came of age in the 1950s and 60s in the industrial post-war boom. But this sense of like honor, this sense that your family name means something, that the people who you develop relationships with are really owed something by you and that they owe you something in return, is definitely like one of the more distinctive Appalachian traits, and one of those things that I still remain incredibly proud of. And I do think that it's unfortunately just not present enough amongst our leadership class. I mean, your audience may not know this, Chris, but I think you and I have become good friends in the past couple of years. And one of the things that I feel like you and I talked about this recently, is there is this weird willingness among political leaders, and by the way, like I've seen this on both sides of the aisle, to just totally stab each other in the back, or stab their staff in the back, or stab anybody in the back if it helps them get ahead. And there's just a part of my brain that will never quite compute that type of a personality trait. Like there, certainly are some people who you have to discard, and I understand that. But like you've got to be loyal to your core group of people, if for no other reason than it's good for your own soul. And if you're doing things that are bad for your soul, eventually it's going to come back to bite in the rear end.
Yeah, I mean, this question of what is friendship and what is loyalty really is, I think it's essential. I mean, it's an essential human question, but it's really pretty maybe it's more important in the present moment because I feel like it's been degraded. Maybe not in general in American life, but it's certainly been degraded in elite culture. I think that's definitely true. There is this super transactional mercenary sense about it. It's kind of funny. There's a truth that people say, which is that people who are involved in crime professionally, like they have to be loyal and they have to tell the truth because they can't go to the police. And by the way, the penalties for never not doing so are pretty high. And in a way, you think about that as like, gosh, in a way that's I'm not involved in crime professionally, but I'm going to assume that makes common sense that's probably true. And yet that in a way is where there's a moral superiority to the way elites think about the world. And I don't know. It's when as you said, you and I've had this conversation. There are other people who kind of hear this conversation and scratch their heads, and because there's always the yeah but. There's always like the how you lawyer your way through what loyalty means or what friendship means. Like what are the outs and what are the exceptions? Yep. And basically, that's the problem, right? Everybody's thinking, yeah, no, I'm totally a loyal friend, except for when things exceed a certain risk tolerance or whatever. And they always think that, they think that things exceed that threshold, basically 5 times a day. When in actuality, if you're being a good friend and know what loyalty means, that might happen a couple times in your lifetime.
Yeah, it occurs to me just in this conversation that it's sort of the flip side of what we talked about earlier, the hyper-transactional nature of some of these friendships, right? Where if it's all sort of a contractual relationship for mutual benefit, right? I'm your friend to the extent that you give things to me, and you're my friend to the extent that I give things to you. It's just really easy to discard these relationships once they become no longer useful to you, sort of however you define that utility, right? So it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and certainly I think about a lot, is my grandparents, in a lot of ways, a very non-traditional relationship. They fought a lot. They were very, earlier in their lives, they were even violent with each other, but they never got divorced, right? They for most of my childhood, they didn't even live in the same house, right? That was sort of how much, my grandfather, I lived with my grandma much of my childhood, and my grandfather would come over around 6 or 7 in the morning. They'd hang out all day. They'd play cards, and my grandpa would leave around 8 or 9 to go to bed. And it's sort of interesting. Like I always thought of them as like divorced in my brain when I was a kid, but they never were. They were never actually divorced. And that, again, there's this weird sense of just devotion for its own sake that I think has its downsides, to be honest. It certainly has its downsides, but I think is a very useful trait and something that I just don't see enough among the professional class in this country.
I saw something, you may have seen it too, but I've seen it a few times on Twitter, which if you want to see something horrifying, just go on Twitter. It won't take long. But it was somebody, I don't know, it was a woman that I saw the first time. There was a man, I think, the second time, but sort of 40s or 50s. And exactly sort of striver class. I mean, if you just read their like Twitter bio, and they said I'll get this wrong, but the paraphrase, I'll get the gist right. But it's I'm this old and I'm divorced and I'm gonna die alone and I'm gonna be old alone and I'm really happy about it. And that's like a huge that's a lie. B, it's a huge cope, and C, why are you saying that to a bunch of people you don't know? If you're so happy about it, you don't have to post it on Twitter.
Well, it's, it reminds me, not to pick on George Conway, but I mean, look, the guy doesn't like Trump, and that's fine. But
I hadn't noticed.
yeah, the way that he talks about Trump and sort of implicitly his wife just really, really, really bothers me in a way that's totally non-political.
Yep.
Again, like I can disagree with the guy's politics, but there's just something like deeply, profoundly malevolent about talking about your wife's employer and using your public platform. And frankly, using her position within the presidency to gain more esteem and power for yourself as a critic of that same president, right? I just find that so icky, right? There, I mean, my wife is a lawyer, and there are certainly clients that she has worked for, will work for, that I think to myself, I'd rather you probably didn't work for those people. Works for big corporate law firms, and sort of, takes a ton of different clients, some of which I like and some of which I don't. But I would just never say publicly, I'm going to beat up on on one of your clients, because you just don't do that. You don't talk about people that you care about. You don't talk about the work that they do in that way. It just really, really gets on my nerves.
Because one of the things, like with George Conway, or if you were to do something like that with one of your wife's clients, one of the attractions for the spectator there is that they know that you are desecrating that relationship, yes. Right? And that's the point of it. It's not just that George Conway doesn't like Trump; he doesn't have to. It's that he's violating the relationship with his wife, right? Yes. That's the thing that makes that turns it from something that's political to something that is like sort of salacious, and like there's a sadistic element to it.
That's right. Yeah, and you could even see some of the media reports have that salacious element to it, right? They love, the mainstream loves to report on this marriage. And I find it just so icky that instead of seeing this as sort of a tragedy, and as frankly George Conway being a bad guy, we have this weird tabloid mentality about it. It just, again, like so many things in our culture, we're attracted to the ickiest and most disgusting things. But it would be good if sometimes we were just honest about what that is and what his posture is within this political moment.
You said something interesting earlier, which is when you got into Yale, sort of your immediate, reaction or thought about the value and attraction of getting into Yale was, great, now I can have like a solid income for the rest of my life. I can get married, hopefully find the right woman, have kids, and the white picket fence. Yeah. And but that's like super Ohio of you. I just wonder, like, is that you would know maybe better than I would, but I think maybe that's not what a lot of people who get into these elite institutions immediately think.
I definitely think that the future that a lot of people envision for themselves is different from the future that I envision for myself, right? And my sense, just from my classmates, is that this is heavily contingent on where they grew up, right? So if they grew up in a pretty wealthy family in Manhattan and went to a fancy New York prep school, their sense of what they want out of their lives is going to be much different than, my buddy who grew up in rural Texas. Or, one of my best friends is this guy. He's a Canadian conservative writer named Jamil Javani. Grew up sort of working class, mixed race. His dad was black, his mom was white, in pretty rough neighborhoods in Toronto. But for him, he certainly, like, what he wanted out of his life is find the right girl, get married, have kids. And I find that people who come from really tough family backgrounds, that's often how they define their sense of you call it the American dream, or I guess in Jamil's case, the Canadian dream, because he lives back in Toronto now. I think in some ways what you see among the professional class is that the family lives are so privileged that people don't really know what they're missing sometimes, right? So, if you grew up with mom and dad in the house, and you grew up in an environment where that striver mentality was very much present, you maybe don't realize just how tough it is to grow up in an environment without an intact family. So, my guess here, and again, this is all conjecture, I haven't necessarily seen any evidence that would support this. My guess is that a lot of the professional class is sort of coasting off of the familial relationships that were intact among their parents and grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they're going to find that unless you actively work to rebuild that for yourself, it doesn't naturally. Right. And so you see a lot of people getting married very late. You see a lot of people, I think, struggling to form families, either because they got married so late that it's actually biologically difficult.
Yeah.
Or because, they've decided to build a life in a city, or even if you're earning a decent wage and working in a nice law firm or whatever the case may be, it's not that easy to have enough space to where you can raise a family comfortably. So I guess a long way of answering, I do think it's very Ohio of me that I wanted those things. But I also think that there's something a little bit more deeply wrong about sort of professional class interests that we maybe don't necessarily see right now, because a lot of sort of class millennials are still pretty young. But I think as sort of those folks get into family formation, my strong suspicion is that they're going to really delay marriage and childbearing. And over the long term, probably aren't going to have as many children, probably aren't going to have as many successful families, certainly as their parents and grandparents had. Which of course is terrible, right? I mean, what is a nation if not a place where families can raise children happily and healthily? And unfortunately, that's of course happening much less in our country for a host of reasons. I don't want to just pin it on professional class folks in New York and Manhattan and DC, but certainly that's a big part of the problem.
I've just been sort of thinking about this, like, what does a successful country look like, or a successful culture look like? And there's the super ideological answers to that, sort of the right-wing version of that. It tends to be some version of more liberty, right? And then there's like a left-wing version of it, which is equality or justice. And those are total non-answers. Like, I don't know. I mean, like, I'm sitting here recording with you. I'm looking out the window and I don't see any of those things, right? I mean, I can't identify them. And so it occurs to me that maybe it would be smart to be like less idealist and more materialist on some of these things when we're trying to come up with what we think is successful, and then just go back to the basics. Is your country, is it secure from foreign threats? Can people live in your country and be secure in their homes from like criminality? Are families being formed? Are kids being had enough to perpetuate at a minimum the next generation? Are people healthy? Are they living? Are they physically healthy?
Yep.
I don't know that if you did those things, I don't know. Yeah, it seems to me like you got a pretty good start there. And those things almost never get talked about except as an afterthought.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the questions I'm often asked, because I've been on the past couple of years on this kick where I just am terrified about America's fertility trends, and the fact that we've now reached the point where we're below replacement level fertility. We're just not having enough children, to your point, to perpetuate the next generation.
Not a little below, by the way. I mean, this is like, you and I are on the same page of this. So, like, we're well below trend and have been for a long time. There's a little blip there for a couple of years where we're kind of sort of at break even, but over the past sort of 30 years, we're way below replacement.
Yep. Yeah. And there are all of these reasons to sort of care about this. And the classic stuff that we would, I think, tend to talk about as political conservatives, or just at least as political people who care about the economy and the nature of society as well. One, we have a welfare system that's built effectively on some measure of replacement. It's hard to have enough workers to pay the taxes to work in the fields that are necessary to support the generation that's getting older and dying, unless you have children coming online pretty much constantly. There's I think an economic innovation argument that's interesting, that places that have higher fertility rates, higher birth rates, like Israel, for example, are much more economically innovative and dynamic. And there are all these sort of theories about why, right? Like, one plausible explanation is that children provide this sort of social connective tissue. They force parents to get together for school, for play dates, for whatever the case may be. And they sort of cause the sort of society to be a little bit more socially dynamic. And of course, when it's more socially dynamic, people are getting together, they're forming businesses more, they're talking about scientific ideas more, and all these things are good. And I always find that when I sort of start to give that defense, the economic defense of higher fertility, I always just realize like that stuff all matters, but that actually isn't the most important thing to me, right? So like, I have a 3-year old and an 8-month old at home, and all of my friends now are now fathers, or at least all of my sort of most, I should say, most of my really close friends from back home are now fathers. And you watch the effect that it has on people, right? The relationship that they have with their kids, the relationship that they have with their wives, how they think about their community in the future, how they think about their work and what's necessary to sort of pay it forward and ensure their children have something sort of stable and comfortable to grow up in. The way that it makes them more patient, the way that it makes them more thoughtful and empathetic. It's just having kids actually makes you a better person. I believe this very deeply. And, Chris, I'm a person, and I feel weird talking about this. I maybe shouldn't, because I wrote a book that talks about this, but certainly some demons in my own childhood. And, last night I watched a small piece of Empire Strikes Back. My son is like getting really into Star Wars. I watched a small piece of Empire Strikes Back. And of course he didn't really understand it, but just like sitting on the couch with him and watching that movie was just profoundly spiritually and emotionally invigorating to me. Like in a way that, I know you're a father and it's hard to explain, but I just went to bed thinking to myself, what an amazing moment that was to sort of watch this thing that I cared about as a kid and to talk through it with my own child. And it's just, little things like that I think really matter. Like, I know we're both practicing Christians. One thing that I've always said about myself as a Christian, I'm not very good at, is I don't pray as much as I should, but every night with my 3-year-old, before he goes to bed, we make sure to say our prayers, right? There's just these basic cadences of life that I think are really powerful and really, really valuable when you have kids in your life. And the fact that so many people, especially in America's leadership class, just don't have that in their lives, I worry that it makes people more sociopathic and ultimately our whole country a little bit less less mentally stable. And of course, you talk about going on Twitter. Final point I'll make is, you go on Twitter and almost always the people who are most deranged and most psychotic are people who don't have kids at home.
Yeah, no, there's a huge like sort of humanizing, socializing force that kids work on their parents.
Yeah.
There's other forces they work on their parents too, but I think generally good.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll give like my example of this, which is like I grew up in a Christian family, grew up in the church, and, you sort of, especially when you're young, you're trying to figure that out, and sort of ebbs and flows. But I can tell you that the thing that focused my mind like nothing else was having kids. Because at that point you realize, hold on, I grew up doing this. I do believe it. I'm practicing it, but I have to do it in a better way because I'm responsible for these kids and for teaching them these things.
Yep, absolutely.
What I guess you sort of brought up a topic that I was going to get to later, but it's sort of the innovation stagnation thing that you're talking about, that there's these societies that are where their population is growing, particularly when it's growing organically. It's true that there's more innovation. Like Tyler Cowen's written about this, Peter Turchin's written about this. There's different people of like, they're sort of all overlapping, interrelated theories. But I mean, the thing we know is that, societies that grow organically, and maybe by immigration too, but definitely when the population's growing historically, you look back and they've been more successful, they've been more innovative. Sort of the basics are you get economic growth one of two ways, population growth or productivity growth. Productivity growth raises living standards. Population growth just basically means you get more in the aggregate, but it's producing the same amount of output.
Yep.
I guess just as kind of like an entry point here is, here's the place to start is, what is your understanding of the stagnation thesis? Like, do you find it compelling? I think you do, but like, how do you understand it? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so I definitely find it compelling. So I think, my test of this is look around your house and ask yourself, what are the things that are here that didn't exist in the 1950s, right? And outside of computers and IT, like pretty much everything that I have in my house right now exists in the 90s. Like I even live in a very old house in Cincinnati, which until very recently had knob and tube wiring in it, right? Which of course existed in like the late 19th century, right? Um, you hop on a plane, you fly to Paris. It takes you longer to fly to Paris now than it did 30 years ago. Um, our sort of sources of energy, of course, we have, some innovation there with fracking and, sort of greater use of natural gas, but like fundamentally what we're doing in energy is the same thing that we were doing 50 or 60 years ago. In some ways, we're even going backwards because we're not building as many nuclear plants or like any nuclear plants. And we were, of course, doing that in the 1950s. So I mean, long story short, I do buy this idea that there's some broad stagnation. I mean, why is it happening? I think the classic formulation, I'll sort of give the Peter Thiel answer, and then I'll give the Robert Gordon answer, a Northwestern economist. And Bob Gordon's answer is that technological innovation has just gotten harder, right? This is classically called the low-hanging fruit argument, that it's just harder to innovate than it was in the 1950s, that a lot of the technological and economic growth that we've gotten in the past few decades has come from innovations, whether it's the combustion engine, nuclear power, sort of microwave technology, things that had been developed in the early 20th century. We sort of squeezed as much as we could out of the lemon, and now we just find ourselves pretty stagnant. And I think the Thiel answer is that there is just something like deeply broken in the culture of innovation that makes scientific progress harder. It's not the science is harder, it's that the culture of the scientists has changed. And I'm more inclined to sort of Peter's answer than I am to Robert Gordon's thesis. I think there are various ways in which, just to throw out a few ideas, I don't mean for this to be an all-encompassing answer, but I think a few things that are going on in our scientific community. I think one is that our scientific community has just gotten more political, right? And so, you see, statements going around from whether it's public health officials or biological scientists, talking about, their views on the gender identity question that our society is so obsessed with these days. And I find my response to that is, if you spent less time worrying about like the modern political arguments about gender identity, you maybe could spend more time worrying about finding a cure for cancer, right? So I do think there's this way in which political debate occupies cognitive space that otherwise would go to scientific innovation. So I think that's one thing that's going on, is just our scientific problems are downstream of our political problems. I think a second thing that is going on is certainly that people who are innovative are also optimistic. People who are building new things are optimistic. And it's harder to be optimistic when you live in a society that seems to be sort of decaying. And whether you see that in the birth rates going down, whether you see that in sort of other indices of progress, there's just this weird way in which I think a lot of people feel like things are getting worse. That becomes a self-reinforcing thing. That culture of stagnation is, I think, and unfortunately built into our society in the same way that culture of innovation was really built in the 50s and 60s. I think a third thing that's going on, I don't know why this is, I felt a lot about this, but I don't know why it is that people are just less willing to take risks. And so, a pretty classic pathway for a professional class American in 2020, and I'm talking about, the elite of the elite, sort of the quote unquote best and brightest in our society, is you go to Yale Law School, you go to Harvard Business School, you go to the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and you look at what those people are doing when they graduate. The gross majority of them are not founding companies. They're going to work in law firms, they're going to work in consultancies, they're going to work in investment banks, which, all fine. I have a lot of friends who work in those various fields. There's nothing wrong with going and working at a stable job. But my sense is that in the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of people who were at the top of our educational spectrum who were more willing to take very real risks, to start their own company, to go and pursue a crazy scientific idea. And so there's just a little bit more of an aversion to risk taking among the people who you would expect to be starting businesses. Because, I'm like very much the sort of guy who says, there's a lot of honor in just going and working at a steady job and providing for your family. I don't think that everybody in our society needs to be or should be an entrepreneur, but you need some people to be entrepreneurs. And I think you just have much less risk taking among a lot of the well-educated class in this country. And then, a final point that I'll make is, it's sort of related to the risk-taking point, is that people are just more afraid to step out of the Overton window on a lot of stuff, right? And you sort of see that sort of most obviously in politics, right? There are just certain things that you're not allowed to say or you'll get fired. We saw, of course, Google fired James Damore, the guy who authored the famous memo on gender diversity in the engineering and computer sciences. If you're terrified of saying something too far outside of the Overton window, you're just going to be less innovative, right? And so I think there is a tension in our society between allowing truly wacky ideas, even though admittedly a lot of them are going to be wrong, but at the same time giving enough space to wacky ideas such that people who are genuine innovators can go out there, step outside, take the risk, and actually turn those ideas into real viable products and services for people to use. And I think we're just kidding ourselves if we think that, if we grow up in a society where, again, the best and the brightest are too terrified of saying something wrong, then that's cognitive space that's going to go to not saying something wrong instead of building something that's truly innovative.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's, the sort of best and brightest are hyper tracked.
Yes.
Right. And so there's every incentive is to color inside the lines, and just, you optimize for, you basically sort of optimize for efficiency inside of those lines. You're never optimizing for, sort of parabolic growth, or you're never optimizing for doing something different. It's just, if you follow this path, then you can get 4 weeks of vacation and, whatever. It's sort of management, not innovation. And we wound up with all these managers and no innovators, or not many. They certainly aren't coming out of elite institutions because people are being taught not to.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's definitely a problem of too many managers, not innovators. I mean, I wonder, I haven't thought seriously about this, Chris, whether there's a component of this that's material, right? So if you graduated from an elite engineering school in the 1950s, you could go and start a company, but even if that company ultimately failed, it wouldn't be financially ruinous. Whereas if you go to Manhattan and live in a $4,500 a month 1-bedroom apartment, and your kid is going to a preschool that costs more than most people's, private Catholic schools in the middle of the country, like, is there just a way in which the managerial impulse has entered the society because the material consequences for failure are higher? Maybe something like that is going on. And this is one of the reasons why, I spend most of my life as an investor, and we do venture capital in the middle of the country. But like, one of the theses of our fund is just that there's actually more risk taking in the middle of the country, especially when it comes to hard problems, in part because, the consequences of failing aren't quite as bad in Indianapolis, where you can still have a decent home on class wage, as they are in New York City, as they are in San Francisco.
Have you thought about, you think about the great wave of American growth and innovation, and the Gordon book, by the way, is really good. It's actually sitting right over there.
Oh, interesting.
I come down where you do, though. I think he's wrong. All these problems seemed really hard and intractable when people solved them. right?
Right.
That's just the way they always seem before they get solved. But nonetheless, it's a great book, and he did a good bit of sort of laying out the history and laying out the questions in a really smart way. But one of the things that that I've been thinking about, and I'm working on writing on something about this right now, is what the impact of having a frontier is, like a physical frontier, and what the meaning of the frontier closing is.
Yep.
So I mean, the American frontier really, it didn't truly close until the 50s, like if you include Alaska and Hawaii, which isn't that long ago.
Yep.
And, I grew up in Arizona, which is where I am now. I mean, even when I was a kid in Arizona, I mean, Arizona became a state in 1912, but, so it's the 48th state, but it wasn't really until the 80s that growth took off here. I mean, it was a very sparsely populated state for all the obvious reasons. And so there was a lot, it wasn't a frontier, but there was still sort of that spirit, because it was not as, just due to technology like any place else, it wasn't as connected to the rest of the country, but also because there was there was a lot of open space and people could do things. And so, that kind of relates into the sense of optimism